So we are continuing and solving absolute value equations, and now we are just going to be stepping up our previous problem just a notch, because the previous problem just was not hard enough. The harder the problem, the more exciting the problem. So let's get excited, you guys. Alright, so just like before, eventually, but not yet, wait for it, eventually we are going to have two equations to solve just like we did in example 1, but before we do that, we have to have absolute value bars alone on one side of your equation. So currently this positive 7 and this 3 right here are getting in the way. So we have to move those to the other side of the equation before we can separate our absolute value into two separate equations. So I'm going to rewrite the problem so we know exactly what needs to move to the other side before we can solve. So the 3 and the plus 7 must move to the other side before we can separate our absolute value into two separate problems. So I'm just going to rewrite it like this so you guys can kind of see what must move to the other side. So everything in green has to move to the other side before we can solve this problem. Now, I'm going to warn you, you can never, ever, ever distribute a number inside of absolute value bars. It is not allowed. The demon cats will come for you if you ever distribute inside of absolute value bars. So this is illegal. So this is something to watch for. So this is illegal. Don't even try it. You cannot do this. You cannot sit there and distribute this 3 into absolute value. That's not allowed. So you can't say this is like 3 times 2x, which is 6x, and 3 times negative 3, which is negative 9. That right there is not allowed. So don't even try to do that. That's where the demon cats will get you. So this is illegal. Don't even try it. Don't even think about it. Alright, so basically we want to get absolute value bars by itself. So we need to move the 3 over and the positive 7. Now when you move things to the other side of an equation, multiplication you move at the very end. You move addition or subtraction first. So first I'm going to be moving over the positive 7. So positive 7, how we move that to the other side is by subtracting the 7 on both sides of our equal sign. 4 minus 7 will give me a negative 3. Alright, so I still have this 3 out in front that's giving me problems, but now this is what my equation looks like. 3 times the absolute value of 2x minus 3 equals negative 3. So I still must move this 3 to the other side before I have two separate equations that I'm going to solve. So since this 3 is multiplying to absolute value, if you ever see a number written next to something and there's not any operation in the middle of it, you can always assume there's a multiplication right there. So the way that we move something that's multiplying to the other side is to divide it on both sides. So the 3's will cancel out and turn to 1 on this side. Alright, and we are left with the absolute value of 2x minus 3 equals, and then on this side, negative 3 divided by 3 equals a negative 1. So now that I have absolute value bars all by itself on one side of my equation, this is when we write our absolute value equation into two separate equations. So if you remember from the previous problem, what I like to do is separate this into two different problems with my neat and organized line. So on one side of absolute value, we drop the bars, so whatever's left in the absolute value bars are 2x minus 3. On both sides we write that. That stays the same. Now the only thing that changes, on one side you set it equal to whatever it currently equals. So it currently equals a negative 1. Alright, and then on the other side, we set it equal to the opposite of whatever that is. So the opposite of negative 1 is a positive 1. So on one side you set that bad boy equal to what it currently equals. On the other side you set it equal to the opposite. And from there you can just solve. Now in a moment we're going to address this and how you could kind of know what the answer is from here. But I'll go over that in just a moment. Be patient. Alright guys, so let's start solving. So for this first one we just solve for x like we normally would. So first I'm going to move negative 3 to the other side. Which the way we do that is by adding 3 on both sides. Alright, negative 1 plus 3 is 2. So now we are left with 2x equals 2. And then the way that we move multiplication to the other side is by dividing it on both sides. So on this side, 2 divided by 2 cancels out and turns to 1. So we're left with x. And then on this side, 2 divided by 2, it also will cancel and turn to 1. 2 divided by 2 is 1. So one of my answers is 1, but I'm not going to circle it yet because remember, after we check, sometimes we have answers that are sneaky little ninjas that act like they're answers, but they're not answers. So you got to watch out. Okay, so now we're going to do the same thing on this side. So the first thing I'm going to do to get x by itself is to add my negative 3 onto both sides. The opposite of a negative is a positive. And 1 plus 3 gives me 4. So now I'm left with 2x equals a 4. The way that we move this 2 to the other side, since it's multiplying to the x, remember if there isn't anything in between two numbers, you can always assume it's multiplication. Alright, so the way we move that to the other side is through division. And what we are left with, I'm going to extend my bar down to keep it organized. 2 divided by 2 cancels out and turns to a 1. So we're left with 1x, or just x, means the same thing. X equals 4 divided by 2, which equals 2. Now before we check our answers, before we circle our answers, we must check ourselves. And when you check yourself, you only have to go back to this step. You can go back to the very beginning if you want, but technically when you check an answer, you start where the absolute value is by itself. That's a little bit easier to do, but it doesn't matter. You could start from here or here. So checking, you could start here, the check, or here. It does not matter. As long as absolute value bars are by itself, that is where you can check. So now let's move on to checking our answer. See if these are valid answers or not, or if they're secret little ninjas. Gotta watch out. Alright, so we're going to be substituting in these two values of x back into this x and see if we get negative 1 both times. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to split this in half to keep it organized. So on the first side, we're going to check to see if x equals 1 is a possible answer. And on the other side, we'll be checking if x equals 2 is a possible answer. Alright, so I'm starting from here. So I'm going to write everything in blue except for x. And the x we're going to replace with 1 time and 2 one time. Alright, so the first time we're going to be replacing x right here with a positive 1. So I'm going to replace that x with a 1. Alright, and let's see if we get the correct answer, which should be negative 1. Let's see what happens. So 2 times positive 1 gives me a 2. Minus 3 equals negative 1. 2 minus 3 gives me a negative 1. And remember you guys, absolute value makes everything turn positive, so the absolute value of negative 1 is a positive 1. Holy hot dog, you're probably like, wait a minute, Miss Long, something is off. 1 does not ever equal negative 1, never. Okay, and we can put a slash through that saying that does not work. So since this did not work, we know that this x equals 1 is not an answer, and we call that answer extraneous. Does not work, so it is called extraneous. Now, we're going to test to see if x equals 2 works. If x equals 2 does work, we'll circle that answer. If it does not work as well, none of our answers will work, so we'll call that a no solution. But let's see what happens. So again, we can start from this phase where absolute value is by itself. So we're going to substitute 2 in for this x right here. Alright, so now we're replacing the x up here with a positive 2. Let's see what happens. So 2 times 2 gives me a 4. We're trying to see if this will give me a negative 1. Let's see. 4 minus 3 gives me a 1. And the absolute value of a positive 1 turns everything positive, so it's going to remain positive 1. Holy hot dog, you're probably like, Miss Long, what's going on? It happened again. Okay, well this definitely does not work. So both of our answers do not work and they are both called extraneous. Now whenever you have two answers that work and none of our answers work at all, both of them were extraneous, so none of the answers work, what we call that is no solution, because none of my answers work. So my following answer will be no solution. And we're sad because we want something to work out. So these are sad answers, they do not work out. Poor things. So our answer for this is no solution. And that's it, you guys. On to example 3.